Hello everyone, and welcome to our third and final module for Chapter 5. So as I mentioned in the last video and the one prior, this module is again a little bit shorter than the others, so it shouldn't really take that much time for us to get through. So far we've discussed sleep and its various stages and disorders and theories of dreaming and sleeping. Then we moved on to discuss some other altered states of consciousness, such as mind wandering, hypnosis, and the disorders of consciousness. And so finally, we're going to talk a little bit about some psychoactive drugs and how they might influence our consciousness. So module 5.3 is on drugs and conscious experience. So psychoactive drugs are defined as substances that affect our thinking, behavior, perception, and emotion. The reasons that people might give for taking these drugs vary. So some people use them to alter consciousness, others use them for religious purposes, some use them just simply for recreational purposes, and others use them for things like pain management or psychological escape. So despite the reason for taking the drug, over time, users may build up what we call a tolerance, which is when repeated use of a drug results in a need for a higher dose in order to get that intended effect. So long-term use can unfortunately result in physical dependence or psychological dependence. Physical dependence being the need to take a drug to ward off unpleasant physical withdrawal symptoms. And then the psychological dependence is when an emotional need for a drug develops without any underlying physical dependence. So you don't really have any physical symptoms if you withdraw and you decide not to take that drug, but kind of psychologically, mentally, you've become dependent on it. It makes you, feel better or helps serve some kind of psychological escape purpose. So in terms of how these drugs might impact our brain, because as we mentioned, calling them psychoactive drugs, we're meaning that they're primarily kind of activating or kind of having their effects within our nervous system. So the short-term effects of drugs can be caused by a number of different brain mechanisms. So we have both agonists, which would be a drug that kind of increases the effect of or kind of replicates the effect of another substance, or an antagonist, which would actually kind of block the effect of another substance or another neurotransmitter. So there's 4 different ways. The first would be altering the amount of neurotransmitter being released at the synapse, so whether it's increasing or decreasing the amount of neurotransmitter that's actually being released into that synaptic cleft. The second could be preventing the reuptake of the neurotransmitter. So we talked about reuptake a little bit when we talked about communication between neurons, and basically what that means is that typically after the neurotransmitter is released into the synapse and binds with the postsynaptic neuron and has its impact, then a lot of the times it will be kind of taken back up by that presynaptic neuron. So in this case, the drug would be preventing that from happening, which thus increases the amount of neurotransmitter that's available for use. An example of a very common type of drug that prevents the reuptake of a neurotransmitter would be SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. The third would be blocking the receptor for the neurotransmitter, so kind of getting in the way of the receptor on that postsynaptic neuron and not allowing the neurotransmitter to kind of come into contact with that postsynaptic neuron. And then the fourth would be binding to the receptor in the place of the neurotransmitter. So in this way, it might be kind of actually mimicking the effects of that neurotransmitter. It's binding to the receptor that's specifically designed to kind of accommodate that neurotransmitter. Because as we mentioned, neurotransmitters do fit with the receptors in kind of a lock and key type mechanism. So if you look at the little diagram here, things like cocaine and amphetamines stimulate reward centers in the brain. And so cocaine actually works by blocking the reuptake of dopamine. So, by blocking the reuptake, which is that kind of second point there, it would be increasing the dopamine available within the synapse. And then methamphetamines work by increasing the release of dopamine at the presynaptic neuron. So they're making more dopamine be released to begin with. So you can see how both are kind of achieving the same purpose of increasing the dopamine available for use, but just through slightly different mechanisms. So there seems to be no single cause of drug dependence. It seems to be a mixture of different biological, psychological, and social factors. It is an interesting result in that isolation has been shown to have an effect on drug dependence. So kind of contrary to popular belief, because a lot of people would think, you're more likely to do drugs if you're kind of in a social situation. But actually, they've conducted kind of experiments with rats or studies with rats where they basically allowed rats to self-administer morphine, and then they divided them into two different conditions. So they were either able to socialize with other rats, which would be in the social female and social male conditions here on this chart, or they were unable to socialize. They were housed in isolation. So those would be the caged females and caged males on this chart. And what you see is that the ones who were allowed to socialize with other rats, they tended to rely far less on the morphine consumption, even after that initial period of being allowed to self-administer morphine. Whereas the ones who were isolated and didn't really have kind of, I guess, the distraction of having other rats to socialize with, you can see that they use kind of significantly more morphine during that period, especially for the caged females. The caged females were very much more likely to be increasing their morphine consumption once they were isolated. And we also see that those with impulsive personality traits and those who have tried alcohol at a young age are more likely to abuse drugs. There are several major categories of drugs that we'll discuss in this chapter. So we'll talk about stimulants, hallucinogens, opiates, and sedatives, and then we'll finish with alcohol and marijuana. It's a little differently than they're kind of written in order here, because the textbook did, in the new edition, kind of switch things around a little bit. Now, based on the more recent legalization of marijuana, it's kind of lumped in the alcohol category because that's when we start talking about the drugs that are more likely to be legal rather than illegal substances. So with stimulants, hallucinogens, and a lot of opiates, a lot of those tend to be illegal substances. A lot of sedatives are actually legal. So for example, barbiturates and benzodiazepines, they are prescription medications, but they are legal. And then of course, both alcohol and marijuana are legal in our country right now. So we'll talk about those towards the end as well. So here's a nice little chart that kind of shows the major categories of drugs for you. So we have the stimulants, marijuana, hallucinogens, opiates, sedatives, and alcohol. So I'll leave this chart in here and I'll let you kind of take a look at it yourselves. Just basically summarizes a lot of what we're going to talk about in a bit more detail in the next few slides. So stimulants are a category of drugs that speed up activity in the central nervous system. So stimulants stimulate the central nervous system. They typically enhance wakefulness and alertness, and they include things like nicotine and caffeine, as well as cocaine, amphetamines, and methamphetamine. So obviously things like nicotine and caffeine are illegal substances, whereas the other ones not so much. So in moderate doses, they can cause excitement, confidence, and euphoria, while in large amounts they may cause anxiety, jitters, and hyperalertness, and overdose may cause convulsions, heart failure, and unfortunately even ultimately at times death. So despite the fact that people who are kind of under the influence of stimulants, they seem to perceive themselves as having an increase in energy, an increase in peppiness, energy reserves do not actually increase. And when they wear off, users may experience fatigue and irritability. So you can imagine that that would be the case if you feel like you have a lot more energy, so you do a lot more stuff, and then when it wears off, you probably feel even more fatigued and irritable than you were in the beginning. Ecstasy, also known as MDMA, is kind of an interesting one to note here because it's typically classified as a stimulant, but it also has hallucinogenic effects as well. So we're going to kind of stick it here under the category of stimulant, but I actually believe in the old textbook it was kind of listed as a standalone because it doesn't really fit perfectly into any of our major categories. Next, we'll talk about hallucinogenic drugs, which are also known as psychedelics. So they are substances that produce perceptual distortions, and these distortions can be either visual, auditory, or tactile, which means having to do with your sense of touch. So essentially what they're doing is disrupting normal thought processes. They may produce hallucinations, and they include things like LSD, which is a laboratory-made drug that triggers unusual sensory experiences. Mescaline, which is also known as peyote, it was used primarily by a lot of kind of Native American tribes and things like that originally. Salvia divinorum, which is a herb that grows in Central and South America, and it induces highly intense but short-lived hallucinations when it's smoked or chewed. And salvia has actually also been known to at times lead to dissociation, which we kind of talked about in the last section when we talked about hypnosis, but basically kind of a detachment between the self and the body. And then other substances such as ketamine and psilocybin. So psilocybin is kind of more commonly known as mushrooms or magic mushrooms. And so emotional reactions to hallucinogens can vary from person to person and from one time to another. Some people misperceive their own thinking and they attach deep significance to objects, events, or thoughts that are rather ordinary. So they might spend, hours thinking about the meaning of the number 7 or something like that. Like basically what happens is they start to kind of attach far more significance to things at times than is actually warranted. And the effects of certain hallucinogens can be very long lasting. So for LSD, for example, the effects can last for up to 12 hours or even more, which is quite a long time to be under the influence of any substance. Next, we'll talk briefly about opiates. So you've probably heard of opiates. They're also known at times as narcotics. They are drugs such as heroin and morphine that reduce pain and induce extremely intense feelings of euphoria. So they bind to endorphin receptors within the nervous system. So basically, when we talked about different ways in which the drugs can impact your nervous system, they're binding to those endorphin receptors and basically mimicking kind of the effects of naturally produced endorphins within our body. So they can have a very powerful effect on emotions and may decrease anxiety and motivation, but effects vary. Opiate drugs are often used in the ER, so things such as fentanyl, which I'm sure you've all heard of, and oxycodone, which is more commonly known as OxyContin, are used to treat extreme pain, but they have very high abuse potential. So because they are so effective treating pain, but they also produce those very pleasurable feelings, unfortunately people tend to abuse these types of drugs, even kind of the legal forms. So treating opiate addiction is incredibly challenging because people often continue to use just to avoid withdrawal symptoms. So unlike some of the other types of drugs we'll talk about, withdrawal from opiate drugs is associated with very extreme withdrawal symptoms. And we do find that substances such as methadone, which is kind of a synthetic version of some of these drugs, can help. So you might notice the name opiate, it's kind of associated with the opium plant, which is actually where heroin and morphine come from. So basically all the drugs within this category are either kind of deriving from that plant or synthetic versions of things that are kind of derived from that plant. And then finally, with respect to our 4 major categories, we have sedatives, which are also known as depressants. And of course, they depress the activity of the central nervous system. So the stimulants stimulate the central nervous system, the depressants depress activity, so they slow it down. They include tranquilizers, barbiturates, which were kind of an older form of a sedative, benzodiazepines, which are kind of a newer form, and chemicals used for huffing. So in moderate doses, they can cause calm or drowsiness and reduce things like anxiety, guilt, tensions, and inhibitions. But in large amounts, they can cause insensitivity to pain and overdose, can cause irregular heartbeat, convulsions, and even death. So barbiturates, as I mentioned, were an earlier form of medication, which were used to treat anxiety and promote sleep. But they did find that higher doses could shut down brain areas that regulate breathing, which obviously is not good for anyone involved. So the newer forms, benzodiazepines, increase the effects of GABA and are much less likely to be fatal. So they include things like Ativan, Xanax, Valium, Klonopin, all of those PAM drugs like lorazepam, clonazepam. Basically, they all fit within kind of the category of benzodiazepines, and therefore they would all be considered sedatives. So again, based on what we see here, a lot of the sedatives that are floating around, and even the ones that are kind of commonly abused, are actually legal substances to begin with. So they are prescription substances, but unfortunately at times they are used for non-medical purposes. And then we have alcohol. So alcohol is by far the most commonly used drug. It's found in almost every culture, although the cultural norms affect its use. So there are certain cultures, for example, within Europe that might think that, having a drink with your meal is something that is completely acceptable, even from a relatively young age. Whereas there are other cultures and other races that are much less likely to use alcohol because they actually have, at times, even genetic predispositions that cause them to tend to react negatively to alcohol in general. So basically, alcohol targets GABA receptors and it decreases activities in the areas of the frontal lobes, which are involved with inhibiting behaviors. So it does act a lot like a depressant in large doses. Unfortunately, despite its widespread use, it can lead to some very negative consequences, including assaults, unplanned pregnancy, and drinking and driving. It has been determined that university students actually drink significantly more than their peers who do not attend university, which might not really come as that big of a surprise to you. I know when I was in university, I lived in residence, and definitely that was true for the people that I live with. But there are certain interventions that can help curb excessive drinking behavior. So for example, offering members of a fraternity either monetary rewards or entry into a raffle if they were able to keep their blood alcohol below a certain level was actually found effective in terms of helping to decrease the amount of drinking that some of these people were doing. So finally, we will talk about marijuana. So marijuana is a drug made from the leaves and buds of the cannabis plant, and it produces a combination of hallucinogenic, stimulant, and relaxing or narcotic effects. So basically that's why it's kind of listed on its own here instead of in one of those categories, because it is definitely a really big example of a drug that doesn't fit neatly into any of those categories. So the buds contain a high concentration of a compound called tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. And so THC actually minimizes the effects of anandamide, which is a chemical that occurs naturally in the brain. So it's actually interesting to note that THC, or marijuana, is actually one of the only drugs that we actually have a system for. So we have a cannabinoid system that naturally occurs within our body. So obviously it wasn't meant specifically to take in THC, but it was designed to kind of respond to the effect of anandamide, and THC does basically mimic that effect almost perfectly. And so it can induce feelings of euphoria, relaxation, reduced pain, and heightened or distorted sensory images. And it also stimulates appetite, which of course you've probably all heard of people who get the munchies when they're smoking cannabis. And it kind of sounds funny in that regard, but it's actually been really helpful, especially with people who, for example, might be undergoing chemotherapy, because it can help reduce nausea and increase appetite in these patients who a lot of the time are having a lot of difficulty eating and having any sense of appetite when they're undergoing that type of treatment. So we do see that heavy marijuana use is linked to a 4-point decline in IQ and impairments in memory, but it has also been shown to be very effective and with less severe side effects than other medications for various medical purposes. So we still have a lot of research to do, and thankfully, whether you disagree or agree with legalization, the one kind of major benefit that's definitely going to come from it regardless is that now we're able to conduct a lot more research and detailed research into kind of the potential uses of marijuana to help kind of treat illness and things like that, and whether or not it really is effective. So this is a table from your textbook that kind of shows a little bit about the frequency of drug use among grade 12 students. So we do know that the abuse of prescription as well as over-the-counter drugs is becoming increasingly common in Canada. And so this data is from a 2008 nationwide survey that basically is indicating the percentage of grade 12 students who have tried a drug at least once. So we do see, as would probably be expected, that alcohol is by far the most commonly kind of tried drug among high school students. So over 80% of students are reporting having tried alcohol at least once. Tobacco and marijuana are kind of a close second and third there. So just over 50, maybe 55% have tried tobacco, and maybe 52, 53% have tried marijuana. Still a significant proportion we see have tried hallucinogens. I would hazard a guess that probably one of the most common ones would be psilocybin or those kind of magic mushrooms. So you see that about 20% of grade 12 students reported having tried a hallucinogen at least once. Prescription drugs, maybe around 16, 17%. Ecstasy, maybe around 15%. Cocaine has still been tried by approximately 10% of grade 12 students, which is a little surprising. And then we do see salvia, amphetamines, and heroin all coming in under 10%. So basically, you know, it's not a perfect survey, of course, but it does kind of indicate to you just how common some of these drugs are in terms of use, even in a younger population. So finally, I want to conclude with a little conversation about the psychology of drug effects, and this isn't really something that's touched on so much in this textbook as it was in our last textbook, but I think it's really important to keep in mind. Because a lot of people would assume that the effects of a drug are automatic, so regardless of who you are, where you are, what you're doing, you take a drug and you're going to feel its effect. But they do actually depend heavily on several factors. So the first are individual factors, so things such as your weight, your metabolism, your level of emotional arousal, personality traits, and physical tolerance. All of those things can greatly impact the effect that a drug would have on you. For example, we know, even if you talk about something like alcohol, if you have, you know, a very tiny person who's, say, you know, 90 something, 100 pounds, and then you have a person who, you know, is a little heavier and maybe weighs, you know, twice their weight, maybe they're a lot taller as well, you're probably not going to get the same impact from the same amount of alcohol in that case. However, if that really tiny person was somebody who had drank quite frequently and they've developed a tolerance, then maybe they'd be able to drink the same amount and not see the same effects. So it really does depend on a lot of those individual factors. The second would be experience with the drugs. So reactions change as a person becomes familiar with the drug's effects. So a lot of the time, people indicate that the first time they try a drug, they might not really feel it as strongly, or they might feel it kind of very differently than they do subsequent times as they become kind of more used to what to expect. The third would be the environmental setting, so the context in which the person takes the drug. So, you know, if you are out at a club with your friends and you drink a glass of wine versus you are home alone and you're getting ready for bed and you drink a glass of wine, well, in the first case, maybe that glass of wine kind of lowers your inhibitions and you're able to kind of dance with your friends and have a good time. Whereas in the second case, when you're kind of home alone and getting ready for bed, maybe it just makes you a little drowsy and want to sleep. So definitely the context in which the person takes the drug can have a major impact on how it affects you. And then finally, the mental set. So basically your expectations about the drug's effects or your reasons for taking it. So what you hope that you're going to get out of it. Because as we mentioned, even when we talked about hypnosis in the last module, the kind of expectation that the person has about what a substance or a process is going to, what kind of an impact it's going to have on them, can greatly impact what effect it does have. So actually we do find that mental set may have a more powerful effect than the properties of the drug itself. So interesting to note, there have been studies where basically they might use a placebo. So essentially they want to measure the effects of alcohol on something, and they have one group who say are drinking rum and coke, and the other group might be drinking coke with, you know, rum extract in it, so not actually any alcohol, just to kind of mimic the taste. And you will see individuals in both groups, including the group that didn't actually drink any alcohol, probably acting in ways and really seeming like they are actually drunk. So that would have a lot to do with their mental set and their expectations for how that drug is going to impact them. So that is it for Module 3, and that's the end of Chapter 5. If you have any questions, please let me know. Other than that, this will be posted as our first lecture for after our break next week. So you'll have plenty of time to look through these lectures, and then when we come back after the break, we will basically have Monday for this lecture, then Wednesday we will have kind of a review session. So we'll have a kind of a live Zoom call again, and then finally the Friday after we return from break will be our test 3. So thanks for listening, and let me know if you have any questions or comments.